Some secrets are written in ink, carved into skin, and hidden in plain sight. What happens when a woman training alone in a gym filled with Navy SEALs discovers that one small tattoo holds the key to a mystery that will transform not just her workout routine, but her entire understanding of courage, brotherhood, and what it truly means to belong? This is the story of how a simple morning at the gym became the beginning of an extraordinary journey that no one saw coming. Sarah Martinez had always been comfortable being different. At 28, she was used to walking into spaces where she didn't quite fit, where conversations stopped and eyes followed her movements. But nowhere was this feeling more intense than at Iron Brotherhood Gym, a converted warehouse in Virginia Beach that had become the unofficial training ground for active duty and former Navy SEALs. The gym didn't advertise. There was no fancy sign, no social media presence, and certainly no welcome mat for civilians. Word spread only through the tight-knit military community, and, somehow, through a friend of a friend, Sarah had gotten a membership. She needed a place to train seriously for her upcoming CrossFit competition, and Iron Brotherhood had the equipment and intensity she craved. Every morning at 5:30, Sarah would push through the heavy steel door into a world of chalk dust, clanging metal, and testosterone. The gym smelled of sweat, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was brotherhood, maybe it was shared sacrifice. The men who trained there were a different breed. They moved with purpose, their bodies carrying invisible wounds and visible scars, their eyes holding stories that Sarah could only imagine. For 3 months, she had maintained her routine. She would arrive, nod politely to whoever was there, claim her corner of the gym, and train in focused silence. The other members weren't unfriendly, but they weren't exactly welcoming either. She was an outsider, and everyone knew it. Sarah understood the dynamic. These men had earned their place here through blood, sweat, and sacrifices she couldn't comprehend. They had served their country in ways that demanded everything from them. Her presence, while not unwanted, was tolerated rather than embraced. She was the civilian who worked in marketing, who had never faced enemy fire, who slept safely in her suburban apartment while they had spent years in hostile territories. But Sarah wasn't deterred. She had grown up the only girl in a family of 4 brothers, had played Division I soccer in college, and had spent years proving herself in male-dominated environments. She knew how to earn respect through consistency and performance rather than demanding it through words. Her training was methodical and intense. While others gathered in groups, sharing stories and pushing each other, Sarah pushed herself. She had designed her own program, focusing on functional movements that would translate to competition success. Olympic lifts, gymnastics movements, endurance work. She attacked each session with the precision of someone who had learned to depend on no one but herself. The regulars began to notice her consistency. Jake Morrison, a former SEAL Team 6 operator who now worked as a contractor, would occasionally nod in her direction. Marcus Tank Williams, whose shoulders seemed to span the width of doorways, had started racking his weights after seeing her clean up after her own workouts without fail. These small acknowledgments meant more to Sarah than they probably realized. But it was Tom Bradley who first spoke to her beyond basic gym etiquette. Tom was different from the others, quieter, more reserved, carrying himself with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than physical exhaustion. He was probably in his mid-30s, with graying temples and scars on his forearms that told stories he never shared. Unlike the others who trained in groups, Tom often worked out alone, just like Sarah. "You're consistent," he had said one morning, 3 weeks into her 4th month at the gym. Sarah had just finished a brutal workout that left her lying on the floor, staring at the industrial ceiling and trying to remember how to breathe normally. "Excuse me," she had managed, propping herself up on her elbows. "Every day, same time, same intensity." That's rare. Tom was loading plates onto a barbell with mechanical precision. Most people burn out or find excuses. You don't. It wasn't much, but it was the first real conversation she'd had within these walls. Sarah had smiled and thanked him, but Tom had already returned to his routine, signaling that the moment of connection was over. As weeks passed, their interactions remained minimal but meaningful. A shared understanding of the weight room etiquette, a mutual respect for each other's space and intensity. Tom would sometimes offer to spot her on heavy lifts, and Sarah would return the favor when asked. They were both loners in a place full of brotherhood, finding an odd comfort in their shared solitude. Sarah began to notice things about Tom that others might have missed. The way he favored his left shoulder, suggesting an old injury. How he never talked about current deployments like some of the others, implying he might be out of active service. The careful way he moved through certain exercises, as if his body was a machine that had been repaired too many times. Most intriguingly, she noticed his tattoos. Tom had several, which wasn't unusual among the SEALs who trained at Iron Brotherhood. But there was one on his forearm that caught her attention, not because of its size or artistic merit, but because of how deliberately he seemed to keep it covered. During the hottest days, when everyone else stripped down to tank tops or went shirtless, Tom kept his long-sleeved shirt on. When he did roll up his sleeves, he did so carefully, never exposing that particular section of his forearm. Sarah's curiosity was piqued, but she respected boundaries. Everyone in this gym carried secrets, and she had learned that the most important rule was not to ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. She focused on her own goals, her own training, her own journey toward the upcoming competition that would determine whether all these early morning sessions were worth it. But fate has a way of revealing what we try to hide. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. Sarah had arrived earlier than usual, hoping to get through her workout before the usual crowd arrived. The gym was empty except for Tom, who was already deep into his routine. She claimed her usual corner and began her warm-up, noting that Tom seemed more focused than usual, lost in whatever internal battle he was fighting. She was 40 minutes into her workout when she heard the crash. Looking up from her deadlifts, she saw Tom on the ground near the pull-up station, his face pale and his breathing labored. Without thinking, Sarah dropped her barbell and rushed to his side. "Tom, what happened? Are you okay?" He was conscious but clearly in distress, his hand pressed against his left shoulder. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his grimace suggested otherwise. "Just tweaked something. Happens sometimes." Sarah knelt beside him, her years of first aid training from her college soccer days kicking in. "Let me help you sit up slowly. We should call someone." "No," Tom said firmly, then softened his tone. "I mean, I'm okay. Just need a minute." As he shifted to sit up, his sleeve rolled back, and, for the first time, Sarah got a clear look at the tattoo he had been so careful to conceal. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the image itself that shocked her, a simple compass rose with coordinates below it. It was the coordinates she recognized. Sarah's father had been in the army, deployed to Afghanistan multiple times before his death in a training accident when she was 22. She had memorized everything about his service, including the coordinates of the forward operating base where he had spent his final deployment. The numbers on Tom's arm matched those coordinates exactly. The connection hit her like a physical blow. Her father had mentioned working with Navy SEALs during that deployment, had spoken with admiration about their professionalism and brotherhood. Could Tom have served alongside her father? Was this tattoo connected to the same mission, the same place where her father had spent his last months of life? Tom noticed her staring and quickly pulled his sleeve down, but it was too late. The secret was out, hanging in the air between them like a question that demanded an answer. "That's FOB Chapman," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom's face went completely still. The color that had been returning to his cheeks drained away again, but this time it had nothing to do with his physical injury. "You know that place?" he asked, his voice careful and controlled. "My father was stationed there. Staff Sergeant David Martinez, Army Rangers. He died 6 years ago in a training accident, but that base, those coordinates, they were his last deployment." The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, two strangers realized they might not be strangers at all. The gym around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of shared connection and unspoken questions. Tom looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just the determined civilian who had earned her place in their sanctuary, but the daughter of a warrior who had never known the full story of her father's service. "Martinez," he repeated slowly, as if testing the name against his memories. "Sergeant Martinez, who ran the combat training program with the Rangers?" Sarah's heart stopped. "You knew him?" The question hung between them, loaded with years of unanswered questions, grief that had never fully healed, and the possibility that this accidental meeting might finally provide the connection to her father's military life that she had always craved but never known how to find. Tom struggled to his feet, Sarah helping him steady himself. As he stood, she could see the weight of decision in his eyes, whether to open a door that had been closed for 6 years, whether to share memories that might bring comfort or pain, whether to honor the brotherhood that extended beyond death by embracing the daughter of a fallen comrade. The morning light streaming through the gym's high windows seemed different now, illuminating not just their shared space but the beginning of a connection that neither of them had expected to find. Sarah's solitary training routine was about to become something much more significant, and Tom's careful isolation was about to be challenged by the one person who might understand the weight he had been carrying alone. As they stood there, surrounded by the tools of their individual battles for strength and purpose, both realized that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not when we're looking for them, but when we're simply showing up, day after day, ready to face whatever challenges await us in the iron and chalk dust of our chosen sanctuary. The coffee shop 3 blocks from Iron Brotherhood Gym was worlds apart from the intensity they had just left behind. Where the gym demanded silence broken only by the rhythm of exertion, this place buzzed with the comfortable chatter of civilians starting their day. Sarah sat across from Tom at a corner table, both nursing cups of black coffee and navigating the strange territory of unexpected connection. Tom had insisted they leave the gym before continuing their conversation. Some stories don't belong in that space, he had said simply, and Sarah understood. The gym was about present strength and future goals. What they needed to discuss lived in the past, in memories that carried weight too heavy for a place dedicated to lifting it off. Your father, Tom began, his voice careful, was one of the finest soldiers I ever worked with. And I need you to know that before I tell you anything else. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. For 6 years, she had pieced together fragments of her father's military service from official letters, brief conversations with his army buddies, and her own imagination. Now, sitting across from someone who had actually been there, she felt both eager and terrified to fill in the gaps. He saved my life, Tom continued. Saved a lot of lives, actually. Your dad didn't die in some routine training accident, Sarah. That's what they told families because the real story was classified, and, honestly, because the truth is sometimes harder to carry than a comfortable lie. The coffee shop seemed to grow quieter around them. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone mentioned her father's death, but this time it was mixed with something else, anticipation, maybe even hope. What really happened? She asked. Tom stared out the window for a long moment, gathering his thoughts or perhaps his courage. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone sharing a burden he had carried alone for too long. It was July 2018. I was part of a SEAL team working with your father's Ranger unit on a joint operation in the Kunar province. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks on coalition forces throughout the region. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: get in, capture or eliminate the target, get out. Sarah listened intently, her father's face coming to mind, the way he had looked during his last leave, tired but determined, carrying himself with the quiet confidence that had always made her feel safe. Your dad was in charge of establishing our perimeter and coordinating with local Afghan forces. He spoke Pashto better than most of our interpreters, and he had this way of earning trust that made operations smoother. The local fighters respected him, which was crucial for missions like this. Tom paused to take a sip of his coffee, and Sarah could see him organizing the memories, deciding what details mattered and what might be too much. The insertion went perfectly. We fast-roped into the valley just before dawn, established our positions, and began the approach to the compound. Your father was with the blocking force, preventing anyone from escaping while my team cleared the buildings. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't. The familiar phrase made Sarah's stomach clench. Military families learned that "until it wasn't" are the words that change everything, the moment when routine becomes tragedy. The intelligence was wrong. Not about the target being there, he was, but about how many fighters he had with him. What we thought was a small cell turned out to be a major operational meeting. We walked into a compound filled with experienced fighters who were ready for us. Tom's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see him reliving the moment, the way trauma survivors do when forced to revisit their worst memories. The firefight started immediately. Heavy automatic weapons, RPGs, the works. We were outnumbered probably 4-1, and they had the advantage of prepared positions. My team was pinned down in the main building, taking casualties, and our extraction was compromised because the landing zone was under fire. Sarah felt tears starting to form, but she blinked them back. She needed to hear this, needed to understand what her father's final moments had been like. That's when your dad made the call that saved us all. He could have waited for additional support, could have played it safe and let us figure our own way out. Instead, he took his squad and assaulted the position that had us pinned down. Drew all their fire onto himself and his men so we could maneuver and complete the mission. The pride in Tom's voice was unmistakable, but so was the pain. He was hit during that assault. Took shrapnel from an RPG that landed close to his position. But he kept fighting, kept directing his men, kept ensuring we had the support we needed to get everyone out alive. By the time we cleared the compound and could get to him, he was unconscious from blood loss. Sarah's composure finally cracked, and tears began flowing freely. But Tom wasn't finished. We got him to the helicopter, got him back to the forward operating base, and the medics worked on him for hours. He made it through surgery, was stable, was going to make it home. Your father was tough, Sarah. Tougher than most people have any right to be. But then, what happened? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be devastating. 3 days later, he was doing physical therapy, preparing for transport back to Germany and then home to you. He was walking laps around the medical facility when an insurgent mortar attack hit the base. Random chance, bad luck, whatever you want to call it. One shell landed near the medical building. Your father pushed 2 wounded soldiers away from the impact zone and took the full force of the blast himself. The silence that followed was complete. Sarah understood now why the official story had been a training accident. The truth was more complex, more painful, and ultimately more heroic than anything she could have imagined. The tattoo, she finally managed. Tom rolled up his sleeve completely, revealing the compass rose and coordinates she had glimpsed earlier. Every man who was there that day got one. Not official, not authorized, just something we did to remember. The coordinates aren't just for the base, Sarah. They're for the exact location where your father made his stand, where he chose to sacrifice himself so others could live. Sarah stared at the tattoo, understanding now why Tom had kept it hidden. It wasn't just a memorial, it was a responsibility, a reminder of debt that could never be fully repaid. How many? She asked. How many what? How many people lived because of what he did that day? Tom considered the question seriously. Directly? My 6-man team, his 4 rangers, and the 2 wounded soldiers he pushed to safety. 12 people who went home to their families because of your father's choices. But, indirectly? The intelligence we gathered from that mission prevented 3 major attacks on civilian targets. Hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. The weight of her father's sacrifice settled over Sarah like a blanket, heavy but warming. For years, she had struggled with the randomness of his death, the seeming meaninglessness of losing him to a training accident. Now she understood that there had been nothing random about it. Every choice he made had been deliberate, heroic, and consistent with the man who had raised her to believe that some things were worth fighting for. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked. Why didn't his unit reach out, or the SEALs he worked with? Tom's expression grew uncomfortable. Military families get a lot of visits after someone dies in combat. Well-meaning people who want to share stories, pay respects, help process grief. Sometimes those visits help, but sometimes they make it harder to move forward. Your father made us promise that if anything happened to him, we wouldn't burden you with the weight of what he did unless you specifically sought us out. He knew he might not come home? We all knew, every mission. But your dad was particularly worried about you having to carry the burden of his choices. He wanted you to remember him as your father, not as a symbol of military sacrifice. He said you were strong enough to build your own life without feeling obligated to live up to his legacy. Sarah laughed through her tears, recognizing her father's protective instincts even from beyond the grave. He had always tried to shield her from the realities of his service, preferring to focus on her achievements, her goals, her future rather than his own dangerous present. But, here you are, Tom continued, training at a SEAL gym, pushing yourself harder than most people ever will, living up to his example without even knowing it. Maybe that's not coincidence. The conversation continued for another hour, with Tom sharing memories that brought her father to life in ways she had never experienced. Stories of his humor under pressure, his skill as a soldier, his constant talk about his daughter and his pride in her accomplishments. Sarah learned that her father had carried her photo on every mission, had shown it to anyone who would listen, had planned to surprise her with a visit after his deployment ended. By the time they left the coffee shop, Sarah felt as though she had recovered a piece of herself that had been missing since her father's death. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was joined now by something she hadn't felt in years, pride that was based on complete understanding rather than blind faith. "What happens now?" she asked as they walked back toward the gym. "Now you decide," Tom replied. "You know the truth about your father, about what he meant to the people he served with. You can take that knowledge and do whatever feels right to you." "But, Sarah?" "Yeah. You've already earned your place at Iron Brotherhood." This just explains why it felt like home from the beginning. As they reached the gym, Sarah realized that her solitary training routine was about to change completely. The men inside these walls weren't just fellow athletes anymore, they were her father's brothers, guardians of his memory, carriers of stories she had never thought she would hear. Tom paused at the entrance, his hand on the door handle. "There are others inside who knew him. They've been watching you train for months, wondering if you were his daughter but not wanting to intrude. If you're ready to meet them, to hear more stories, they've been waiting." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision. She could maintain her solitary routine, keep her father's memory private, continue building her strength alone. Or she could open herself to a community she had never known she belonged to, accept the inheritance of brotherhood that came with being David Martinez's daughter. The choice felt monumental, but, as she looked at the door to Iron Brotherhood Gym, she realized it wasn't really a choice at all. Her father had built bridges everywhere he went, had created connections that lasted beyond his death. Walking through that door wouldn't just be about continuing her workout, it would be about finally coming home to a family she never knew existed. The moment Sarah walked back into Iron Brotherhood Gym, she could feel the shift in atmosphere. Word had spread quickly in the way it does among tight-knit communities, and the men who had been politely distant for months now looked at her with recognition that went beyond simple gym membership. She was no longer the civilian who had earned their grudging respect through consistency and effort. She was David Martinez's daughter, and that changed everything. Jake Morrison was the first to approach, his usual reserved demeanor replaced by something warmer and more open. The former SEAL Team 6 operator had always been intimidating to Sarah, not unfriendly, but carrying himself with the kind of intensity that suggested conversation was a luxury he didn't often afford civilians. Now he walked directly to her, extending his hand with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "Sarah Martinez," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice than it ever had before. "I should have seen it sooner. You've got your father's eyes, and definitely his stubborn streak when it comes to training." "You knew him too?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand that her father's influence had reached further than she ever imagined. "Dave Martinez was legendary," Jake replied. "Not just for what he did on that last mission, but for how he approached everything. Your dad had this way of making everyone around him better, stronger, more focused. We used to joke that he was an honorary SEAL trapped in a ranger's uniform." As if summoned by the mention of her father's name, other members of the gym began gathering around. Marcus "Tank" Williams approached with his characteristic careful movements, his massive frame somehow conveying gentleness as he extended his hand. "Your father spotted me on bench press once," Tank said with a grin. "I was maxing out, probably showing off a little, and the weight got away from me." Dave was across the gym doing his own workout, but somehow he was there in time to help me get the bar back up. Never said a word about it afterward, never made it into a big story. Just helped and moved on. That's the kind of man he was. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but it was a good kind of overwhelming. For months, she had trained alongside these men while carrying the private grief of her father's death. Now she was discovering that his memory lived in this space, that every day she had spent here had been bringing her closer to people who understood exactly what she had lost. Tom stood nearby, watching the reunion unfold with satisfaction. He had carried the burden of recognizing her alone for weeks, wanting to respect both her privacy and the promise he had made to her father. Now, seeing the walls come down, he understood that some promises are meant to be broken when keeping them causes more pain than breaking them. "There's something else," Tom said, raising his voice slightly to address the growing group. "Something we've been planning for months, but never had the right person to make it complete." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, realizing that there were more people present than she had ever seen in the gym at one time. Men were emerging from corners where they had been quietly working out, gathering into what was clearly a planned assembly. "Every year," Tom continued, "we do something to honor the people we've lost. Not just in combat, but anyone who died serving something bigger than themselves. It started small, just a few of us getting together to share stories, but it's grown into something more important." Jake nodded and took over the explanation. "We call it the Brotherhood Memorial Workout. It's held here every year on the anniversary of 9/11. We invite family members, fellow service members, anyone who wants to honor someone they've lost. The workout is brutal, designed to hurt, to make us remember that freedom isn't free and that some people paid prices we can barely comprehend." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, though she hadn't started exercising yet. "This year," Tank added, "we want to dedicate the workout to your father. Not just because of what he did on that last mission, but because of who he was as a man, a soldier, and a father. We've been hoping for months that we'd find a way to contact you, to invite you to participate." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, understanding that this was bigger than just a workout. This was acceptance, belonging, and a chance to honor her father's memory in a way she had never imagined possible. "What would that involve?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. Tom pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "We designed the workout around the person we're honoring. For your dad, we've created something that reflects his approach to training, his favorite exercises, and the kind of mental toughness he embodied." He unfolded the paper and showed her the workout written in precise military formatting: the Martinez Memorial WOD 400-meter run, representing his daily PT runs, 50 burpees, his go-to exercise for building mental resilience, 100 push-ups, done in his preferred style, slow and controlled, 150 air squats, his favorite leg exercise, 200-meter farmer's carry with heavy weights, representing carrying wounded soldiers, repeat for 4 rounds, one for each deployment he served. It's designed to take about 45 minutes if you push hard, Jake explained. The same amount of time your father held that position to allow Tom's team to complete their mission. Sarah stared at the workout, seeing her father's personality and preferences reflected in every exercise. She remembered him doing burpees in their backyard, insisting that they built character more than muscle. She remembered his perfect push-up form, the way he would challenge her brothers to match his standards. Most of all, she remembered his belief that physical training was mental training, that the body could always do more than the mind believed possible. "When?" she asked simply. 2 weeks from today, Tom replied. "September 11th. We'll start at dawn, just like your father would have preferred. Anyone who wants to participate is welcome, but it's not mandatory. Some people honor by doing the workout, others by being present, others by sharing stories." Sarah felt the weight of decision, but this time it felt different than the choice to enter the gym or learn about her father's final mission. This felt like destiny, like a path she had been walking toward without knowing it. "I need to prepare," she said. "This workout is harder than anything I've been doing." Tank laughed, a sound like rumbling thunder. "Your father would have said the same thing. Dave never met a challenge he didn't want to train harder for." "We'll help," Jake added. "For the next 2 weeks, consider yourself part of the team. We'll modify your training, help you build up to the workout, make sure you're ready both physically and mentally." The offer was extraordinary. These men, who had maintained polite distance for months, were now offering to fully integrate her into their community, to share their expertise and support in preparing for what would clearly be the most meaningful workout of her life. What would my father think about this? Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at her. Tom smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. Dave would be proud as hell that his daughter was tough enough to even consider it. But he'd also be worried that we were pushing you too hard, that we were asking you to carry weight that should be ours to bear. But Sarah sensed there was more. But he'd also understand that some things can only be carried together. Your father believed in the power of community, in the idea that shared burdens become lighter and shared challenges make everyone stronger. Over the following 2 weeks, Sarah's experience at Iron Brotherhood Gym transformed completely. Where she had once trained alone, she now found herself surrounded by coaches, spotters, and encouragers. The men who had once acknowledged her with polite nods now offered detailed advice on technique, shared stories about her father during rest periods, and pushed her harder than she had ever pushed herself. She learned that Jake had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had requested to work with Ranger units specifically because of her father's reputation. She discovered that Tank had been wounded on a mission where her father provided medical support, quite literally saving his life. She met Carlos Rodriguez, a former Marine who had never served directly with her father but had heard stories about him throughout 2 decades of military service. Each day brought new revelations about her father's impact on the military community. She learned about his innovative training methods, his skill as a marksman, his talent for languages, and his reputation as someone who could be trusted absolutely in any situation. But, more than his professional accomplishments, she learned about his character, his humor, his loyalty, his unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safely. The physical preparation was intense but manageable. Sarah had been training consistently for months, and her base fitness was solid. What challenged her more was the emotional preparation. Each day brought her closer to a workout that would be as much about honoring her father's memory as testing her physical limits. Tom became her primary coach, designing modified workouts that gradually prepared her for the memorial challenges. He taught her proper farmer's carry technique, explaining how her father had used this exercise to build the strength necessary to carry wounded soldiers to safety. He helped her develop the mental strategies necessary to push through burpee-induced exhaustion, sharing techniques her father had taught him during their joint training sessions. The workout is designed to hurt, Tom explained during one particularly brutal training session. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because your father's sacrifice involved real pain, real struggle, real choice to continue when everything in his body told him to stop. When you're in the middle of those burpees, when your legs are screaming during the air squats, you'll understand something about what he went through that no story could ever convey. As September 11th approached, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly nervous but also increasingly determined. She understood now that this workout wasn't just about honoring her father, it was about proving to herself that she was worthy of his sacrifice, that she had inherited not just his name but his strength. The night before the memorial workout, she couldn't sleep. She walked to her window and looked out at the city lights, thinking about her father's final night alive, wondering what he had been thinking about, whether he had any sense of what was coming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom, "Your father would be proud of who you've become, regardless of how tomorrow goes. The workout is just a symbol. You've already honored his memory by becoming the kind of person worth his sacrifice." Sarah smiled, understanding finally that the past months of solitary training hadn't been preparation for this moment, they had been the real tribute all along. Every morning she had chosen to get up early, to push herself, to maintain discipline and intensity. She had been living the values her father had embodied. Tomorrow's workout would be difficult, emotional, and meaningful. But it was also just the beginning of her life as a full member of the Iron Brotherhood community, surrounded by people who understood both the cost of service and the value of carrying forward the memory of those who paid that cost. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah realized that her father's greatest gift hadn't been his heroic final mission. It had been teaching her to show up consistently, to push through difficulty, and to believe that she was strong enough to handle whatever challenges life presented. The tattoo that had started this journey was just ink on skin, but the values it represented were written into her DNA, passed down from a father who had never stopped believing in his daughter's potential to become extraordinary.